Hello, I'm Alessandra Bucossi, and at Ca' Foscari I teach Byzantine history and literature, Greek language, and paleography. But from next year, I'm going to teach a new course for the new MA in Environmental Humanities, and I'll teach a course called Global Mediterranean, an environmental history of the medieval Mediterranean. And this is a course on environmental history, of course, but with a special focus on Venice and its relationship with the Byzantine Empire. And the Byzantine Empire is the eastern part of the Roman Empire, which survived the fall of the Roman Empire and lasted from the 5th century to the 15th century.
Thank you, Alessandra. Hello, everybody. My name is John Haldon. I'm Professor of Byzantine History and Hellenic Studies at Princeton University in the USA. I'm also Director of the Princeton Climate Change and History Research Initiative and the Princeton AVCAT Archaeological Project, which is a field survey project based in northern Anatolia, looking at a late Roman and Byzantine urban settlement. And as you've gathered from that, I'm a Byzantinist. That's to say, I work on the period from the 5th to the 15th centuries, but my focus is really the transitional period from the 6th to the 10th centuries. And I'm particularly interested in a topic which many people find very boring, but it's really important. That's to say, taxation. Now, before Alessandra and I start our conversation, I had a question for her, if I may, which is, Alessandra, what got you interested in digital humanities?
Well, because I felt my understanding of the history of the Byzantine Empire was somehow, I could say, partial and not complete. I thought that studying the Middle Ages from also an environmental perspective could allow us to achieve some fundamental goals, like, for example, making of history a really interdisciplinary subject, even more than it was in the past. Of course, history is an interdisciplinary subject because you cannot reconstruct history otherwise. But I think we are adding something new. And also because we are enriching the so-called humanities with a fundamental contribution from scientific disciplines. And also because at the end, I think we will offer to our students a more holistic or humanistic kind of knowledge. So that's how I think I thought that was challenging. That's why.
No, it's a good answer. I think that would the same answer would come from lots of people who've developed that interest in recent times.
Yeah, and I think it's a pleasure, really, and an honor to be able to discuss it with you before I start teaching, so that I can ask you also some good advice. In fact, John, you should know, is a cutting edge scholar and has always, decided to study things that other people were not studying. So I would like to ask your first question, John. I was looking at your career and your books. I think, if I'm not wrong, that your first book came out in 1979. Am I right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so
Yeah.
I think things changed quite a lot. I was 5 years old at that time. So you are a Byzantinist. I mean, I've been studying the history of the Byzantine Empire for quite a lot. You specialize, as you said, on things that are very far away from my interest, but we will talk about it even later, like the military, the army, the taxation. But your research focus also on other very interesting things from my point of view, of course, like socioeconomics or political and cultural history. Do you think your idea of the Byzantine Empire changed because of because of the development of environmental history? I mean, did you somehow change your idea of the entire Byzantine Empire, your new interest in environmental history?
The short answer would be yes, but it's a long process. So if I take you back to the 1970s, when I was a graduate student, And my interest was in institutions, in the ways in which pre-modern states, in which I've always had an interest, organize themselves to survive. And the most important aspect of that is their ability to extract and control resources. And those resources can be people or livestock or agricultural surpluses or money and minerals and all sorts of things, usually a combination of all of those. How do ancient states, how do pre-modern states organize that? And what are the implications of that for the way in which society is structured, for example, in terms of access to resources, and more importantly, access to power and to control over people and resources? So starting with the military was an obvious place to begin, because quite often we have purely accidentally much more information about the way in which pre-modern societies organize their armies and their military than about things like how they organize their economy or how they perceive themselves from a cultural perspective. Obviously, we do have information about all of those, but for military things, we often have statistical data, we have archival data, and so forth, and we can combine it with archaeology. So looking at the army wasn't simply a sort of young man's interest in military stuff, which people often thought it was.
Yeah, especially our students, they do.
Some people still do think it's that, but actually it's a way into a deeper understanding of state structures and institutions and how they work. And the reason I went right back to that beginning is because from then on, my appreciation and understanding of pre-modern states generally, but of the East Roman Empire, or the medieval East Roman Empire specifically, continued to evolve from that basis as I took on board new sorts of evidence, new sorts of interests and thematics. For example, when I began my career, I wasn't especially interested in the history of art as a cultural study. But I soon realized that if you're to understand any culture and society, you need to approach it holistically. You can't approach it from a sectoral basis. You can't just look at one bit of it and then think you've grasped the whole. Okay. So I had to involve myself with the study. And tragically, for some students, I even had to teach a bit of art history at some points when I was a junior scholar. I'm not sure if I helped them or not. But one has to look at all the different aspects: literature, art, cultural perception, ideas and beliefs, as well as institutions, economic relationships, and concrete material cultural data from archaeology and numismatics and sigillography, that's to say the study of lead seals and so forth. And so by the time we get to round about 1998 to 2000, I found that the tools at my disposal for understanding the way in which Byzantines perceived and used space, i.e. the terrain and ground that they inhabited and the structures they constructed to put in that space, on the one hand, and my ability to understand distance, which is another aspect of space, of course, on the other, was compromised by the way our sources either did or didn't talk about these things. And so I had to reach out for new tools. And most of those new tools were of an archaeological and or digital nature. And in particular, that's how I came into contact with scientists who work on environmental matters, both the landscape and the way land has, the landscape has evolved and changed over the years, over the centuries and millennia, on the one hand, and the interface between landscape studies and paleoclimate studies. And these suddenly became a really important aspect of my interests, and I started going into them in much greater detail. So for the last 20 years, I've devoted a huge amount of time to reading about and working on that sort of element, while at the same time using that to, if you like, refine and nuance the understanding I'd already built up through the study of the historical and literary and cultural sources.
Yeah. One thing that was particularly interesting, because yesterday we talked a bit between us, and you mentioned, I didn't realize the 53rd Spring Symposium of Byzantine Studies in UK that was supposed to be dedicated to nature and environment. But unfortunately, of course, they needed to cancel it because of the COVID. And one of the topics that we're going to discuss, supposedly, was the idea of environment in Byzantium, also in art history, in literature. So I wanted to ask you, but what was the idea of the Byzantines about environment? What did the Byzantines think of their relationship with nature, and how did they perceive the environment and around them? Was it a kind of peaceful relationship, or they were threatened, or what idea do you gather from your studies?
Well, it's obviously a very complicated question. There are many aspects to that, and I can't hope to answer them all. And of course, if we had the benefit of that conference and its results, we would be able to be a little bit more specific about some of them already. So let me approach it from two perspectives. The first perspective is that of the thought world, if you like, the symbolic universe within which Byzantines were able to do and think about their world. And it's important to bear in mind, and it's perhaps so obvious that people often forget to say it, but that that thought world was encompassed by an entirely Christian theological understanding of the nature of creation and of the way human beings interact with the divine. And so the environment wasn't something which people saw as, well, firstly, they didn't conceive of the environment as a separate thing in the way that we use the word environment. There are Greek words which describe the word environment, but they're not used the way we use them. Rather, the environment was taken for granted in the way that people have done for centuries, millennia, and it was exploited and altered to suit human needs and requirements. Not only the needs and requirements of farmers and people producing food for themselves or for a market or whatever, but also the requirements of those in power, members of social and economic elites who wanted to alter the way the landscape worked to suit their own particular needs and requirements. So, for example, changing the way in which certain agricultural produce was generated to suit particular market demands which they could exploit. So just as today, the environment is there as a source of exploitation and of resources. But on the other hand, of course, it was also there as a concept. And it was the environment created by God in which human beings were meant to live out their lives within the true faith as defined by the society in question, of course. And there was in the literary record, and of course the literary record, we must remember, is the product of a very, very tiny number of educated and literate people in the Byzantine world. Byzantium has the reputation of being a fairly literate society, but actually it's not much more literate than, say, the medieval West for most of the time. The sectors or the vectors of literacy are different. So there's more secular literacy in Byzantium than in the West, at least until the 10th and 11th centuries. But
yeah,
that
one
literature, that literature reflects their own the perspectives of that learned intellectual or less intellectual literary or literate elite, whether they're priests and monks on the one hand, or high churchmen or intellectuals and philosophers and courtiers with a very good education behind them on the other. And those ideas all reflect part of that Christian symbolic universe, which is the sort of thought world within which medieval East Romans lived and thought about their world. And it provided them with a vocabulary, both of concepts and of words, through which they can describe and explain that world for themselves.
Yeah, my question was, since what we read in historical accounts, as you just said, is basically, it is mainly a product of well-educated people, let's say, apart from perhaps, I mean, we have an idea of the general population if we read perhaps some geographical text, but can we get an idea of the impact of some natural events on the general population from this kind of literature? I mean, I must admit that I've never looked for this kind of pieces of evidence. Can we do we have a real picture of how, I don't know, they reacted to earthquake or volcanic activities or something like this?
Yeah, actually, there's quite a lot of evidence about how people responded to natural disasters and catastrophes. And it falls into two sort of categories. One is their explanations for it, and not usually, for most people, there are one or two exceptions, but they are real exceptions. For most people, high and low, natural catastrophes and disasters were acts of God, and they were sent usually as warnings or as punishments for reasons which had to be worked out. Whether it was because the chosen people, the Romans saw themselves as the chosen people, of course, having inherited that role from the Jews who misrecognized Jesus Christ as not the Messiah. The reasons for this divine wrath or punishment had to be found, and it could be found either in the sins of the Romans, or a certain sector of the Romans, or even of its rulers, or in some other cause or other explanation. But such things were sent by God fundamentally. And of course,
but do we know anything about their reactions? I mean, their emotions?
What I was going to come on to was that the second point is that we understand also they had a pragmatic approach to these things, and they understood that you can avert certain sorts of natural disaster by taking appropriate action. Now, one example of that is the long tradition in the Eastern Mediterranean, which isn't just a Christian tradition, it's pre-Christian, of building larger structures with a mixture of both tile and brick and mortar, which could absorb the shocks from minor earthquakes. So people have often, if you go as a tourist to the East Mediterranean, you'll see these large public buildings, which are often banded in stripes. It's stone and then a layer of tile or brick, and then stone and then tile and brick. And those layers of tile and brick acted as a sort of shock absorbing technique. They've been studied by architects, and they've been analyzed in terms of their ability to absorb shocks, and they do work. So what we don't know is to what extent that was a result of trial and error, and to what extent it was sort of conscious planning. And did the Byzantines do it because that's the way buildings were built? Or did they do it because they understood that if you built buildings without this system, they might collapse more readily? My suspicion is that it's probably a combination, depending on the people involved. So there's one example. And we know about, we have references to flood prevention, damming, for example. We have references to careful storage of agricultural goods in case there is a drought or a famine, and so forth. So not universal, but it's regional and local and varies across time. But there is some, and this is something we've been doing a lot of work on very recently, there is some awareness in most societies of how to manage risks. The risks you can't manage are the really massive ones, like huge earthquakes, which just demolish everything, or an enormous volcanic eruption, or something of that sort. Or, for example, most farming communities can cope with a drought of up to 2 years, but after that, then they run out of supplies and food, and the drought turns into a famine, and it can be catastrophic. So it depends very much on context and cultural system.
Okay, you mentioned before an aspect that is very interesting. I mean, this is the relationship between economic history and environmental history. Do you think the two are two separate, independent subjects, or do you think at the end we are more or less talking about the same issues?
Well, they have to be taken together. And actually, the current situation with COVID-19 is a good example because we can all see that, leaving aside the origins of the virus itself, we can all see that this is a natural phenomenon, if you like, which has expanded its effect with disastrous consequences in some parts of the world. As a result of the nature of our economic life and activities, the nature of modern global markets. We also see that it's had disastrous effects on national economies as they've had to cease economic activity in production and trade, and have, as a result, incurred substantial deficits and debts, which will have further implications on economic activity and employment levels and everything else. So there's a very good indication in a much more complex and sophisticated, networked global market of the impact that a natural event can have on the economy. But if we go back to medieval times, there's no doubt that the two are connected, although people at the time often didn't understand the connections. We have to sort of build those connections for ourselves using our rationality.
Yeah. So at the end of the day, we could say that we have really achieved an interdisciplinary approach by now, or is just because, I mean, we are somehow forced to do this? I mean, because we are living on this planet in this moment and the environmental issues are very important for us. I mean, are these issues kind of obliging us to become more interdisciplinary, or we were old enough, ripe enough as historians to enlarge our subject to other disciplines?
I think it's definitely the former. I think it's, times change and people and ideas change with them. And every generation of historians reflects, to a large extent, the cultural values and political assumptions and economic thinking and so forth of their own time. There are always individuals who can break through those barriers, of course, and there are plenty of people who resist change and will stick with a more traditional, if you like, or conservative approach, because that's the approach they were trained in and brought up in, and it's safe for them. So there is one thing with academics generally and intellectuals in particular, is that they're often unwilling to challenge their own achievements, in a sense, which is what you have to do often to move on and to adopt new strategies and approaches, because you throw what you've already done, of which you are undoubtedly terribly proud, into doubt. And so, we have to rethink our own earlier work to some extent. And a lot of people find that very difficult. However, I think, environmental history, or an approach to environmental history, has been around for a long time. There are people thinking about the impact of climate and environment on history back in the late 19th, early 20th centuries. One or two very famous figures. They tended to be very deterministic in their understanding. Now, that determinism is still a problem. And so when you say, are we more interdisciplinary now? The answer is yes, but with certain caveats. So a lot of people think they're being interdisciplinary when, for example, a historian reads some science literature, some climatological literature, some paleoenvironmental material, some landscape studies, some archaeology, and they incorporate those results into their analysis. But it's often the case, it's very often the case, that because they haven't talked to the specialists in question and seen how those specialists work, that they've misunderstood the implications of the work that they're using, and they therefore basically they abuse it, they misuse it, and that means that their history is then wrong. I mean, they're using something which they haven't properly understood to write history, which is by definition therefore going to be faulty. So the way forward, and I still don't think we've really got to, and I'll say why in a moment, a proper interdisciplinarity. But the way forward is to work together in proper research teams across boundaries on a face-to-face basis. Just reading somebody's work and having an email conversation with them isn't the same thing as sitting around a table with them and thrashing the problem out, and then understanding each other's methodological and other issues. And scientists have the same problem with history. There are a lot of articles in the scientific press which are very deterministic and reductionist, and they use history to prove their scientific points, but actually they've misunderstood or oversimplified the history to a point where the historians simply can't really handle the way in which that material is being misused. But this isn't just a problem of generations. There is an institutional issue because of the way we educate people. You know, we are brought up from the age of, say, for most people, once they get to their mid-20s, they focus in a very specialist way on a very small area of a specific discipline. And it takes them 10 to 15 and often 20 years to finish their initial research, publish it, acquire a position, be able to develop their interests on a broader basis. And they've had to completely focus on one area, and they haven't had the chance to develop interdisciplinarity.
Yeah, and also somehow the university has this subject well divided.
Exactly.
So
that's institutionally rooted, and it's hard to escape from that. Having said that, of course, to be a good historian, you do need to spend that time learning the languages, understanding the sources, reading manuscripts and everything else. So you can't really not do that. I'm not quite sure what the answer is, except that the way my team has got around that is that we've actually worked together with a group of 20 or so scientists from different fields connected with what we want to do. And we've had regular meetings, and we've developed joint projects with them where on the principle of everyone carries on with their own research, but they make that research accessible in an appropriate form and language to everybody else on the team. And
okay, so that's how you manage your climate change and history research initiative, basically.
And the point is that you can then work interdisciplinarily without asking people to do extra additional work that they wouldn't normally do. You simply as it were, you revalidate the work that they are doing and put it into a different context. But in order to do that properly, you have to talk with them. You have to work with them. And they feel the same. The scientists want to do the same with the history. So, for example, we've just written an article for a science journal on the way in which ancient societies dealt with pandemic or other crises. And we tried not to be too simplistic and reductionist in our history writing, but at the same time to appeal to an audience that wasn't educated in a historiographical mode, which is quite hard to do. If you know, when we're rooted in such a specialist vocabulary and language.
Yeah, exactly. There are two more questions that I'd like to ask you. The first one is about periodization. I mean, is the environmental history, or better, the climate history, is it going to change our traditional division into periods, or can help us in revising the periods that we, of course, have overimposed on history, and of course we know are fake, I mean, are a tool that we need to use to organize our knowledge about history. But is the climate history possibly going to help us in organizing our division in a way that is nearer to the reality somehow?
So, I suppose the first question is, what is reality? I mean,
yes.
For whom are we talking about?
A good understanding of history, let's say.
I don't think they need to change the how can I put this? Each of these periodizations, whether we're talking about a paleoclimatic periodization, which is in millennia, and tens of millennia even, or a historical periodization, which can be in centuries, or even if you're looking at micro-scale history, in decades, because we're tracking change and process down to a very fine level. These two periodizations, or these two vocabularies of time, are designed for particular purposes. They don't need to come into conflict, and they don't exclude each other either. They run in parallel. So, for example, there is within the climatological history of the world, there is a period known as the Beishahir occupation phase, the BOP for short, which is a period of history which begins round about 1400, 1500 BCE and lasts until 700 or so CE, roughly. And it's typified by certain types of crop and agricultural technologies in the Balkans and Eastern Mediterranean region for that period of time. It's not exclusive. There are other regimes coexisting with it, but it's the predominant one. It's based on olive cultivation, vine cultivation, cereals, and fruit. We talk about the Beishahir occupation phase, but it includes or brackets several civilizational and historical phases. So it includes late Minoan period, Mycenaean, Classical and Dark Age Greece, the Roman Empire, the early Islamic world, etc. Each of which has their own periodizations, of course, as we know. So, but there's no conflict there, because the historical periodization is designed to differentiate between either, if it's archaeological, ceramic types and cultural phenotypes on the one hand, archaeological construction techniques or whatever it might be on the other. Yeah. The historiographical periodization is designed to differentiate between either different language usage, different levels of political or cultural organization, and so forth. And they're all quite arbitrary. It's what we historians have decided over the last 3 centuries are the hallmarks of continuity and change. They're changing anyway all the time. So, for example, when does Byzantine begin? This is the old.
Yeah, no, I was exactly thinking about that. I mean, it's always the first lecture on Byzantine history. How do you divide Byzantine history? And if you need to divide Byzantine history, and when Byzantium start? I mean, that's the typical question.
And I actually find the periodizations pretty useless. They don't help. There are substantial changes. For example, a colleague of mine at the University of Leeds in England, Ian Wood, is a well-known medieval historian. He and I were thinking that actually a major caesura in European history is around about the year 900, which is completely unrecognized as a periodic change. And yet, so we thought we could write a new history book with the year 900 as a major change and see who accepted. But I mean, it would just be sort of a whim of ours to point out certain shifts in the structures of the Carolingian and East Roman empires at that time.
Well, perhaps, I mean, it's interesting, I think, for students, because they learn different approaches. So that's why we keep somehow explaining how different historians divided history, so that they can relate to different, approach to the historical reconstruction. But there is one last question I want to ask you before we close down, and this is the relationship between Byzantium and Venice. I mean, this is a field of research that has always attracted the attention of Byzantinists, because we know, I mean, the link between the two is very tight. But do you think a further development could come from environmental history? I mean, and is it possible that we can also change our understanding of the relationship between the two powers because of the environmental history, or it will be only, let's say, something that enriches our reconstruction, but it's not going to change very much?
So I think it will change, but I don't think it'll transform how we understand the relationship. What it will do is deepen our understanding of some of the structural causes of the changes across time in the relationship. So if we start in Venice, in those sort of marshy islands in the 7th and 8th centuries, when Venice is a sort of refugee settlement, supposedly, of course. I know that's now been challenged by some Italian archaeologists quite recently. if we start in that period, when Venice is basically a rather insignificant, small and still East Roman townlet, or settlement, fishing settlement, salt panning settlement, in that northwestern corner of the Adriatic, and then move up to 400 years later, when Venice is a major imperial power in the Eastern Mediterranean, competing with Genoa as its major challenger, together with Islamic powers. You can see very, very important changes going on. Now, those changes have traditionally been explained, on the one hand, in terms of the political history of northern Italy and the transformations that went on there, as the Exarchate of Ravenna, for example, became less important, as the Lombard kingdom went into and then out of Frankish or German domination, as the relationship with the papacy and southern Italy changes, and as Venice develops a maritime commercial interest and expands its markets, on the one hand, and on the other hand, political vested interests combining with all of those to generate a particular trajectory of the development of Venetian power and influence. But what's interesting is when you look at what we now think we know of the gradual shifts in climatic conditions between the 6th and the 12th centuries, and this, of course, doesn't just affect Venice. It's one part of a much more complex jigsaw puzzle. So everybody's affected by these changes. But one of the things that we see is that in the course of the 10th and 11th and early 12th centuries, there is a considerable improvement in overall climate conditions in that part of the world. And that improvement clearly had an impact on the Byzantine world, because we can see improvements in agricultural output, surpluses, increased markets, and so forth. That happens to coincide also with the stabilization and re-expansion of the East Roman world in the 10th and 11th centuries. But of course, that's also a market opportunity for Venice. So the background to these changes, Venice's increasing market expansion and commercial empire on the one hand, taking advantage of an improved economic situation in the East Mediterranean in both the Islamic and the Byzantine worlds on the other, has to be seen against the backdrop of what's going on in that longer term climatic situation. So we shouldn't say that the climate caused any of those changes, but it was a significant contributory factor in facilitating those changes. So in other words, we can move away from accounts of the history of Venice which rely just on political history and local economic history. There is more to it than that, underlying and behind those factors.
So before we conclude, we were asked to suggest to those who are watching us a book, and I cannot resist, but I'll suggest your book because your book, which is entitled The Empire That Would Not Die, The Paradox of the Eastern Roman Survival Between 640 and 740. And it came out in English in 2016, but was translated into Italian last year, I suppose, or something. And the reason why I would suggest it is that because I really enjoy the fact that, as you just said, we must put together different interpretative frameworks and disciplines to understand a period, and especially to reply to such a difficult question like the one you are asking in your book, like how the Byzantine Empire survived in such a terrible period. But as you just said, I mean, I think you really were able to put all these things in one book, and the way in which you conducted your research is so clear when you read through the book, that I think is really a fantastic piece of scholarship, really. I mean, I really enjoyed it because you take into account so many different aspects. And one of these is also, of course, environmental history, but if you put in this part of the environmental history, I mean, this environmental historical reconstruction into the bigger frame that the book has, it becomes quite clear what can be the role of environmental history in this kind of analysis. But at the same time, you were able to put together things like history of ideas, or explaining us better how the religious beliefs were playing also a role in such a difficult time. So yes, that's the book I would suggest, and I take the occasion also to thank you for having written this book, which is very interesting.
That's very generous.
Your book.
So the book I would suggest actually picks up on the environmental angle. It's a little bit more focused. It's by Adam Izdebski, who is actually leader of a research section in the Max Planck Institute in Jena in Germany. And he's an environmental historian, but also trained as a Byzantinist, and did his DPhil at Oxford. And his book is called A Rural Society in Transition, and it was published in 2013. And it's basically an analysis of the nature of Balkan and Anatolian village society, rural society, in the period from the 6th up to the 10th and 11th centuries, using both the existing archaeological and textual sources, but also, crucially, 50% of the book is environmental data, paleo-environmental data, palynological data, that's to say the evidence from ancient pollen, dendrochronological data from tree rings and so forth, and carbonate mineralogy data, which is looking at the ways in which various minerals found in lake beds and on the sea bottom can inform us about atmospheric conditions in the past. You'd be surprised how much one can know about temperature, climate, and patterns of rainfall several hundred or several thousand years ago using these scientific analytical techniques. And what Adam has done is to extract as much information as he can, accompanied also by a very careful methodological analysis of all the problems that come with these scientific approaches. He's put all these together within the context of our existing understanding of the East Roman Empire's social history to produce a really fine, holistic analysis. And I really recommend that book, both methodologically, but also because of its insights and its educational value in terms of telling people who aren't scientists or who aren't trained as scientists how the science can be helpful, but also what the problems with the science are. And that seems to me a very important thing to do.
So it will certainly be amongst the other bibliographic suggestions for our students next year. Well, thank you, John. Thank you so
very
much.
You're very welcome. It was a pleasure. Bye-bye.
My pleasure. Bye.